The footprints did not belong to her. Pearl Fugate noticed them at 4 in the morning, standing in the doorway of the grain storage shed with a lantern held at shoulder height. The flame bent sideways in the draft coming through the gap beneath the door, and in that shifting light, she could see the impressions clearly pressed into the packed earth floor. Large boots, a man's stride. Someone had walked from the entrance to the far wall, stood there for a time, judged by the depth of the heel marks, then walked back out. The tracks were fresh enough that the edges had not yet crumbled. She stood still and listened. The farmhouse behind her was dark. The valley below was dark. Nothing moved in the yard. Whoever had come had already gone. Pearl lowered the lantern and looked at the shelving along the far wall. Nothing appeared disturbed. The grain sacks stood where they always stood. But something about the second shelf from the bottom caught her attention. The dust pattern was wrong. A rectangular space had been cleared, not roughly carefully, as if someone had lifted an object, examined it, and replaced it in approximately the same position, close enough that a person not paying attention would miss it. She was paying attention. She did not go back to sleep. By the time pale gray light began separating the tree line from the sky, she had already hauled the morning water, fed the 2 remaining chickens, and was splitting kindling beside the back stoop. Her hands worked automatically. They always did. 6 years of work had made her body capable of continuing while her mind went elsewhere, and her mind was still in that shed looking at the disturbed dust and the careful footprints of a man who had not wanted to be heard. She was 17 years old. Her hands showed it differently than her face did. The knuckles were thickened, the palms calloused in patterns that matched specific tools. One finger on her right hand did not straighten, completely caught at the joint from a wire accident the previous spring. When she held the axe, that finger rested at a slight angle, and she had long since adjusted her grip to accommodate it. She did not think about her hands as damaged. She thought about them as paid. Silas Fugate came out of the farmhouse at 7:30 with his coat already buttoned to the collar. That was the first thing she noticed. The temperature that morning was cold but not biting. There was no reason to button a coat before stepping outside unless the intention was to stay outside only briefly, or unless the coat had been buttoned before the decision to come outside was made. Silas's coat had been buttoned before he opened the door. The decision had been made before he stepped through it. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. He did not say good morning. "You're old enough to manage yourself now," he said. Pearl set the axe down beside the stump. She did not set it down because she was done with it. She set it down because she needed both hands free for whatever came next, and she had learned early that keeping sharp objects in hand during hard conversations created problems that outlasted the conversations. "I've been managing since I got here," she said. Silas's jaw tightened. He had not expected that. He had expected silence or tears, and he had prepared for both, but not for a plain statement of fact delivered without heat. He moved to the second thing he had prepared. "The house is mine," he said. "I've kept it since your father died. I've kept you since your father died. Nobody can say I didn't do right by you." He needed her to agree with that. She could hear it in the way he said it, the slight rise at the end of the sentence that was not quite a question, but wanted to be answered like one. He needed to leave this conversation believing he had acted fairly, and the only way he could get that confirmation was from her. Pearl said nothing. The silence stretched. Silas's expression shifted through several things before settling into something harder. "You can find work in town," he said. He went back inside and came out a moment later with a canvas pack. He set it on the stoop without handing it to her directly. "Bread, blanket, preserves, your father's knife." She picked up the pack. It weighed what it weighed. She was turning toward the road when she heard it. A voice inside the house, low and quick, speaking to Silas from somewhere near the back hallway. Not a neighbor stopping by. Not at 7:30 in the morning with snow on the ground and a hard sky pressing down from the west. This was someone who had slept there. Someone who had been inside the house since the previous night. Pearl thought about the grain shed, the careful footprints, the clear dust on the second shelf from the bottom. She thought about Silas's coat already buttoned before he stepped outside. She did not turn back. She walked toward the road. Behind her, after a moment, she heard the farmhouse door close. Not slammed, that would have been emotion. It was closed deliberately with the practiced control of a man who had finished a piece of business and was moving on to the next one. Snow had begun falling somewhere in the past hour. Light and fine laying itself over the ruts in the yard without filling them. Pearl walked out through the gate without looking back. She did not look back because there was nothing behind her now that she needed to see. Whatever was in that house, whatever was being discussed in that back hallway, it was no longer her concern. The road ahead was 12 miles to town across ground that would get harder as the day went on, and every mile she spent looking backward was a mile she could not afford. She had been 17 for 3 months. She had worked this farm since she was 11, brought here after her parents died of the fever that moved through the valley the winter of that year. She had not been brought here out of love. She understood that now, in a way, she had not understood it at 11. She had been brought here because a farm needs labor, and labor costs money, and a grieving orphan child costs considerably less than a hired hand. Silas had not been cruel about it. Cruelty requires a certain emotional investment. He had simply been practical in the way that practical men sometimes are about things that do not trouble their sleep. Her Aunt Margaret had been different. Margaret had been the warmth in that house, the person who taught Pearl which herbs grew, where on the hillside, who showed her how to read weather by the way clouds stacked over the western ridge, who sometimes sat with her in the evenings and did not require conversation. Margaret had died in July. By August, the house had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. By October, Silas had begun looking at Pearl the way he looked at equipment that had served its purpose. She had known for 3 weeks that this was coming. She had seen Silas writing letters at the kitchen table. She had seen him counting what little money the farm had produced in a difficult autumn. She had stayed because there was nowhere else to go, and because leaving on her own terms required preparation that she did not have time to complete before the cold set in. She had stayed too long waiting for an alternative that did not materialize, and now she was on the road in December with a canvas pack and worn boots and the sky coming down heavy from the west. She walked. Movement was heat. That was not philosophy, that was physiology. The body burning fuel to keep itself going, the byproduct of that burning being warmth that pushed outward through the skin. Standing still meant the body stopped generating and the cold started winning. She had learned this from Margaret, who had learned it from someone before her, and she kept it in the front of her mind the way a person keeps something important in a shirt pocket, close and accessible. By mid-morning, the snowfall thickened without intensifying, the kind of snow that does not announce itself, but simply accumulates. The hills east of the road faded into gray shapes. The hills west disappeared entirely. The road itself remained visible, but the margins blurred and distances became unreliable. She passed the old Cutter property, abandoned 3 years now, its fence posts listing at angles that suggested slow collapse rather than sudden failure. She passed the creek crossing where the plank bridge groaned under her weight in a way it had not groaned in warmer months. Her feet were still dry. That would change. It changed at noon when the road dipped through a low section that snow had turned into a thin slick of ice over water. She crossed carefully, but careful was not the same as dry, and the left boot developed a seam of moisture along the inner sole that she could feel with each step. Not dangerous yet, attention requiring. She was thinking about the boot, calculating how many miles remained against how long the boot would hold when she heard the engine. A motor vehicle came from behind her, moving slowly through the snow-softened road. Sheriff's Department. She recognized the vehicle before she recognized the man behind the wheel, and she moved to the side of the road without being asked. Deputy Pershing Creech stopped alongside her. He was a large man in his middle 40s with a face that had been outdoors for most of those years and showed it. He looked at her the way he might look at a situation that required assessment before commitment. "Pearl Fugate," he said. "Deputy Creech." He looked at the pack on her back. He looked at the road ahead of her, which disappeared into snow and distance. He looked at the sky, which was the color of an old bruise. "Road into town's going to be ugly before evening," he said. "Snow's coming harder from the north." She waited for what came after that. The offer of a ride. The question about where she was going. The basic inquiry that a person in authority might make about a 17-year-old girl alone on a winter road with everything she owned in a bag on her back. He said, "Watch yourself out there." Then he drove on. Pearl stood on the side of the road and watched his taillights disappear into the gray. She understood what had just happened. Creech knew Silas. Creech knew this valley and everyone in it, which meant he knew the shape of what had occurred this morning without being told. He had stopped. He had looked at her. He had made a calculation The same kind of calculations Silas made, the kind where the cost of involvement outweighs the discomfort of looking away. And then he had driven on. She did not feel what she expected to feel, which was despair. What she felt instead was a cold kind of clarity. She was alone, not abandoned in this moment, though that was also true. Alone in the older and more permanent sense, the sense that meant she could rely on no one here to make a decision on her behalf. That was not the worst thing to understand. The worst thing would have been to understand it too late. She walked. By mid-afternoon, the snowfall had shifted. The light, fine snow of the morning was gone, replaced by something heavier, with intention behind it, flakes that came down in clusters and stuck where they landed. Wind picked up from the northwest, not violent yet, but steady and purposeful. She was still 4 miles from town by her reckoning, which meant 2 hours in good conditions, and considerably more in these. Her left boot was fully wet now. Her right was holding, but she could feel the sole flexing in a way it should not flex, the stitching, working loose with each mile. The bread in her pack had hardened from cold. She shifted the pack higher on her shoulders and kept walking. She had been watching the hills to her west for the past mile. Not for any particular reason at first, just the habit of someone who had grown up being told to pay attention to the land. But something about the western hills had begun to hold her attention in a specific way. The tree line there was denser than the open road, which meant windbreak. The hills themselves were steep enough to have exposed stone faces where snow could not fully accumulate, which meant potential shelter. And the orientation was right, the slope running northeast to southwest, which would put any hollow or overhang on the protected side of prevailing weather. She left the road. The climb was harder than it looked from below. Snow had drifted between the rocks in ways that gave no warning before the foot plunged through, sometimes 6 inches, sometimes nearly knee-deep. She moved carefully, testing each step, using her hands on the rock faces when the grade steepened. She fell twice. The first time she caught herself and only bruised her palm. The second time she went down hard on her right knee and stayed there for a moment, breathing through the pain, taking inventory of damage. Nothing broken. Pain without consequence is information, not emergency. She got up and kept climbing. The light was going wrong. Not dark yet, but the quality of the remaining light had changed, flattening and going directionless in the way it does when the sky becomes a single surface. She had perhaps 40 minutes before real darkness, and in real darkness on this hillside, the arithmetic changed entirely. She was scanning for anything. A fallen tree, a rock shelf, dense enough brush to cut the wind. She saw the door. Her first thought was that it was a shadow, a trick of the flat light on a dark patch of earth. A rectangle of darkness against the hillside set back beneath a rise of earth that curved above it in an arc that seemed, if she looked without expecting anything to be natural. But if she looked with different eyes, with the eyes of someone who had learned from Margaret how to read what land was doing versus what it had been made to do, the arc was wrong. Natural slopes did not meet vertical faces at that angle. Natural hillsides did not have that particular kind of right angle where the curved earth met a flat surface. She moved toward it. The door was wood. Old wood, the surface gone silver gray with age and moisture, but still solid where she pressed her palm against it. Partially buried under 2 feet of drifted snow, at the base the drift packed hard by wind. Around the door the earth was shaped. Rounded at the top, reinforced at the edges with stones that had not rolled there on their own. Deliberately, someone had built this into the hillside and then let the hillside grow back over it, or had built it in a way that invited the hillside to appear natural above it. She put her hands in the snow at the base of the door and began clearing. That was when she felt it. Not under the snow at the base, but in front of it, the ground itself. The snow in the immediate area in front of the door was flat, in a way the surrounding snow was not. Not flat from settling, flat from being worked. The particular level flatness of ground that has been cleared with a tool, a shovel, or a board or something with a flat face. The clearing was not fresh enough that it had stayed uncovered, but not old enough that the new snow had fully built back up over the leveled ground. Someone had cleared the area in front of this door within the past 2 or 3 days. She stood very still for a moment and listened to the wind and the snow and the nothing else that was present on the hillside. Then she bent and finished clearing the base. The iron handle was cold enough to burn through her gloves. She leaned into it and pushed. Nothing. She repositioned and pushed harder, driving her shoulder into the wood. A groan, then resistance, then the door swung inward on hinges that complained but held. Air came out, not the frozen nothing of outside, different air. Still air, the kind of air that exists in places protected from the sky, that has been sitting in the same space long enough to take on the character of the earth surrounding it. Cool, but not cold in the killing way. Breathable in a way that outdoor winter air stops being breathable past a certain temperature. She struck a match. The small flame showed her a narrow passage leading downward, rough stone steps worn smooth at the center from use. The passage opened at the bottom into a space larger than she could see in the match's limited radius. She could make out the beginning of walls, stone again curving upward. The match burned to her fingers. She dropped it and stood in the darkness. People disappear in places like this. She knew that. Collapsed shelters, old wells, animals denned up in the dark. Every instinct for self-preservation had something to say about stepping down into an unknown underground space when no one knew where she was and no one was coming to look. The wind answered for her. It came off the hillside in a gust that hit the open door and pushed cold through the gap with the efficiency of something that had been practicing all winter. The cold touched the back of her neck and her wet feet and the exposed skin of her wrists where her sleeves had ridden up during the climb. She went down the steps and pulled the door shut behind her. The sound of the storm stopped. Not completely, she could still hear it as a distant and muffled thing, the way you hear a conversation in another room present, but without edges. She stood on the bottom step and let her eyes adjust, and then she struck another match. The room was larger than she had let herself hope. The walls were stone, fitted without mortar in the lower sections and mortared in the upper, curving up and over in an arched ceiling, braced with timber beams that were dark with age but showed no sign of weakness at the joints. The beams were heavy. Someone who understood load and weight had placed them. Along the far wall shelves, floor to ceiling fitted to the curve of the stone, and on those shelves jars, dozens of them sealed with wax, their contents visible as dark masses behind the glass. Beside them, cloth sacks tied at the neck. Wooden crates stacked too high with their contents written on the sides in chalk. Potatoes, turnips, onions. Against the near wall, a small iron stove with an elbow pipe running upward through a hole in the ceiling, a hole that had been mortared around the pipe to prevent drafts. Beside the stove, split wood stacked in a neat rectangle, covered with a piece of oilcloth that had been weighted at the corners with stones. Dry wood. Protected wood. And on the small table beside the stove, a tin cup. Pearl walked to the table and picked up the cup. She tilted it toward the match. Dark residue coated the inside, not the faded uniform. Dark of old staining, but the uneven residue of recent use. Coffee grounds not yet fully dried. Not fully dried the way something dries over years or months. The way something dries over days. She set the cup back down exactly where it had been. She looked at the room with different eyes now. The wood stacked beside the stove was the dry wood of years of accumulation, but the oilcloth covering it showed recent handling. At one corner, the weighted stone slightly displaced. The shelf near the back wall had a gap where a jar had been recently removed and recently returned, the disturbed dust pattern matching the grain shed this morning in a way she could not make herself ignore. Someone had been here. Not years ago. Not the man who built this place, whose last journal entry had been written 7 winters past. Someone more recently, someone within the past several days. She looked at the door at the top of the steps. She had latched it. The latch was iron, simple, effective. She looked back at the room. Then she crossed to the stove, opened the iron door and looked inside. Dry ash cold with the layered look of multiple fires over time. She checked the draft by holding her hand near the pipe joint. Air moved upward. Good construction. The pipe still drew. She arranged tinder from the box beside the stove, small pieces first, then built up carefully. She had 1 box of matches. She used one. The fire caught. She sat back on her heels and watched the small flame take hold of the kindling and then reach upward toward the larger pieces. When the wood was properly lit, she closed the stove door halfway and adjusted the damper for a slow, controlled burn. Not a large fire, enough fire. Then she took off her left boot and held her wet foot near the stove. The pain of circulation returning was the particular bright pain of something working correctly again. She stayed with it and breathed through it, and when it faded, she opened the nearest jar on the bottom shelf. carrots preserved in brine, the seal intact. She worked the lid off with the knife from her pack and ate, standing up slowly, looking at the room. The food nearly made her cry. Not because it was good, though the salt and the texture of it after a day of nothing were better than good. She cried because what the jar meant was that tomorrow existed again. She had walked onto that hillside calculating narrowing options, and now the calculation had changed. She put the lid back on the jar. Portion control. What was in this room was finite, and until she understood how finite, she would treat it like the last of something rather than the first. Near the rear wall, beneath a rough wooden bunk with two folded blankets on it, she saw a box. Plain wood about the size of a large book with a cloth wrapped around it that had been tied with twine. She knelt and picked it up. The cloth was not dusty in the way the shelves were dusty. It had been recently handled or recently replaced. She unwrapped it. Inside the box was a journal. She opened the cover. Ezra Caudle in careful slanted handwriting and a date. She turned pages. The entries were precise and practical, the record of a man who measured his world in quantities that mattered. Outside temperature at dawn and dusk. Wood remaining expressed in days. Potato count by week. Lamp oil consumption by month. The writing was not literary. It was engineering. Every number served a purpose. Between the numbers, occasionally a sentence of explanation. She read one. Built this shelter after the freeze of '71. Ground stays steadier than air. Most people freeze because they wait too long to prepare. She read another. Ceiling beams set to carry twice the estimated snow load. If they ever fail, it will not be because of winter. She read a third. My family is 7 years gone. I am still here. That is what preparation is for. She turned toward the back of the journal. The final entries described a leg injury, a decision to go into town for supplies before the snow came heavy. The handwriting in those final pages was slightly different, the pressure less consistent, the work of a hand managing pain. The last entry was dated 7 winters ago. She turned pages past the last entry. Blank. Then she went back through the middle section more slowly and noticed what she had not noticed, reading forward. Pages were missing. Not torn in the way pages tear when a book falls apart with age. Removed. The cuts were clean, made with something sharp, and they were clustered in a section of entries from approximately 3 to 4 years before the last entry. Perhaps a dozen pages, perhaps more. She held the journal close to the stove and examined the cut edges. They showed no yellowing, no age darkening relative to the remaining pages. The cuts had been made comparatively recently, and at the bottom of the page, immediately following the cut section in handwriting that was not Caudle's pressed in hard enough, that it showed through from pressure alone, someone had written 4 words in the margin. Already said no, price. She read it twice, she read it 3 times, then she wrapped the journal back in its cloth and set it on the bunk beside her and looked at the iron stove and the careful dry wood and the sealed jars on their shelves and the tin cup with its not quite dry coffee residue sitting on the table where she had replaced it. Outside, the storm had arrived properly. She could hear it now, even through the earth and the timber above her. Wind working against the hillside, snow against rock. The sounds of winter making its claim on everything that was not prepared for it. Inside, the stove burned steadily. The arched ceiling held. The earth all around her was doing what earth does, absorbing and moderating and remembering everything that had ever happened within it. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and leaned against the curved stone wall and let the warmth reach into her feet and her hands and the cold places along her spine. And she thought about damp dust patterns and careful footprints in coffee grounds not yet dry, and 4 words written in a margin by someone who had been here before her. Someone who knew what was in this room and had come to see it and had gone away without taking it. Someone who would come back. The fire settled in the stove. The wind pressed against the hillside and found no way in. Pearl Fugate sat in the buried room and watched the light from the stove's half-open door move across the stone ceiling, and she did not sleep for a long time. She woke to knocking, not at the outer door above, at the walls themselves, or that was how it reached her first, translated through stone and earth into something that had no direction. She sat up from the bunk with the blanket still across her shoulders and held still and listened. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals that glowed orange through the iron grate. Hours had passed. The knocking came again, faint, dull, from above and to the left, which meant the outer door. Pearl was on her feet before she had made any conscious decision to stand. She crossed the room and climbed the stone steps and put her ear against the wood. What she heard was wind, and beneath the wind breathing. More than one person. She opened the door 2 inches. The woman standing outside was Melinda Combs, and she was holding a child against her body with both arms in the posture of someone who has been holding that weight for much longer than their strength was designed for. The boy's head was against her shoulder, and his lips, even in the gray light, were the wrong color. Behind them, the hillside was a wall of white moving sideways. Pearl opened the door all the way and reached for the boy first. His name was Zeb. He was 9 years old, and Pearl knew him from the valley, had seen him running the fence lines in summer and sitting in the back of his mother's wagon on market days. Now he was a dead weight in her arms, conscious, but not responding to his name, his fingers curled inside wet mittens that had frozen stiff. She got him down the steps and laid him on the bunk and started with the mittens. The rule about wet clothing was not something she explained. She simply followed it, working fast and methodical. Mittens first, then coat, then boots, replacing each wet layer immediately with the dry blankets from the lower shelf before moving to the next. Melinda stood at the bottom of the steps and watched. Not helpless, just recognizing that the person who knew the room should work the room. Pearl got water warming on the stove. Not hot. Warm the temperature of a late summer creek, because the body coming in from that kind of cold needs gradual, not shock. Sip, she said when she held the cup to Zeb's mouth. Small sips. He drank. The color in his lips began to shift after the second cup, the blue moving towards something closer to living. Melinda Combs sat down heavily on a crate near the stove and put her face in her hands. Not crying, the posture of someone who has used everything they had and has just been told they can stop. After a time, she raised her head and looked at Pearl. Really looked the way people look when they are seeing something they should have seen earlier and are recalibrating around the delay. "You're Silas Fugate's girl," she said. "I was," Pearl said. She was adding wood to the stove, small pieces controlled. The silence that followed had weight to it. Melinda Combs was not a cruel woman. Pearl knew that about her without needing to examine it. She was a woman of the valley who had heard about Silas sending his niece out before the storm and had thought, as people think about things they cannot fix, that it was a shame, and then had continued with her own preparations. The valley was full of people who had done exactly that. Their not acting was not malice. It was the particular cowardice of those who tell themselves that other people's arrangements are not their business. "I should have come to see you," Melinda said. "Before, I should have said something to Silas, or I should have come to find you. I should have—" "Zeb needs more water," Pearl said. She held out the empty cup. "Can you hold this while I refill it?" She put the cup in the woman's hands. Gave her something to do. That was the only forgiveness she had available right now, and she meant it genuinely. Melinda held the cup and Pearl refilled it, and the moment passed into something that both of them could live inside. Zeb slept by early afternoon. He would be all right. Pearl knew the signs of cold that had gone too far, and this had not gone that far. He would sleep and wake hungry and be embarrassed about the crying he had done on the way up the hill, which Melinda told her about in a low voice while they sat together near the stove. "We saw smoke through the trees," Melinda said. "2 days ago, I think. Yesterday. The days are running together. I thought it was hunters. I thought someone was up here who could help." "How bad is it down in the valley?" Melinda looked at the fire. "Henderson's lost their storage shed the second night. Roof came down. The Tackett family is in their main house, but Minerva Tackett sent word around that their wood supply was lower than expected." She paused. "Deputy Creech drove the road twice the first day, and then the road became impossible." Pearl said nothing to that. "Silas," Melinda said carefully, "has not left his property, not to check on anyone, not even to help with the Hendersons." "What is he doing on his property?" Pearl asked. Melinda looked at her. "The night before the storm, there was a man at his house. Someone from outside the valley, I think. Someone in a good coat. He left before dawn." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know what it means." Pearl thought about damp dust and cleared snow, and a man in a good coat examining shelves in a grain shed at 4 in the morning. She thought about Silas's voice in the back hallway and the door closing with the precise control of a man finishing a transaction. She thought so the man in the grain shed was not Silas. The snow outside ran against the hillside with the sound of something insistent and ongoing. Pearl added a larger piece of wood to the stove and said nothing. By evening, the shelter held 7 people. They came in ones and twos following the smoke, the way Melinda had, and each time the outer door opened, it brought cold down the steps like something physical, a presence that immediately began testing the warmth the stove had built. Pearl managed the wood, carefully calculating the new arithmetic of 12 people in an enclosed space. The Henderson brothers came together, two large men in their 30s who had to duck the ceiling beams and who stood looking at the shelves with expressions that mixed relief with something more complicated. A woman Pearl did not know well, Mrs. Garrett from the north end of the valley, arrived with a cloth bundle of her own preserves and set them on the shelf without being asked, which told Pearl something useful about her. An older man named Purvis, who smelled of pipe smoke and moved carefully on a bad hip, filled the last open space near the rear wall and lowered himself onto a crate with the patience of a person long accustomed to managing around a limitation. The food was rationed. Pearl did it openly and without apology, explaining once how much was available against how many people and how many days the storm might last. Nobody argued. The Henderson brothers looked like they wanted to, but looking is not the same as doing, and they did not do it. Then Minerva Tackett arrived. She came with two people in her employment, a woman who cooked for her household and a large, quiet man named Carl, who carried their bags. Minerva Tackett was 50 or thereabouts, with the posture of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in most rooms she entered. She wore a coat that cost more than some families in the valley made in a season. She looked at the underground room with the expression of someone downgrading their expectations in real time. "The Garrity place has a root cellar," she said to no one in particular. "I should have gone there." "The Garrity place is 4 miles from your property," Pearl said. "In this." Minerva Tackett looked at her. "You're the Fugate girl." Pearl. The look that followed was the particular look of a woman recalibrating authority. Minerva Tackett was not accustomed to being in spaces where the person managing things was 17 and currently wearing a coat with a patched left elbow. But she was also practical in the way that people who have managed households and money and other people for a long time learn to be practical. She understood the room quickly enough. "The bed," she said, nodding toward the bunk where Zeb was sleeping. "Zeb Combs is using it tonight," Pearl said. "He came in hypothermic. There are blankets along the rear shelf, and the floor near the stove stays warmest overnight." Minerva Tackett held the look a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she looked around at the other 7 people in the room, all of whom were watching without appearing to watch. "The floor near the stove," she said. "Yes." Another moment. Then Minerva Tackett walked to the indicated space and began arranging her blanket with the precise movements of a woman who had decided to do something and would do it correctly. Carl, the large, quiet man, put his own blanket down beside his employer without being told. The cook settled in on the other side. The room adjusted around them the way rooms adjust when a thing has been resolved. The following morning, Odell Stamper arrived. He came from the north, following the ridge line rather than the valley floor, moving through the snow on snowshoes he had made himself from bent ash and rawhide. Pearl heard him at the door before he knocked and was on the steps before he had finished raising his fist. She opened the door and the cold came in with him, and she shut it fast behind him. Odell Stamper was 31, a carpenter, an occasional farmer, who lived on a small property at the edge of the valley. He was not a man who talked more than the situation required. He stood at the bottom of the steps and looked at the room with 9 people in it, and the coals in the stove, and the organized shelves, and the sleeping boy on the bunk, and he said, "You've been here the whole time, since the first night." He sat down on the bench nearest the door and pulled off his snowshoes and held his hands near the stove. His eyes moved around the room with the attention of someone who builds things and cannot help reading the construction of everything he encounters. He looked at the ceiling beams. He looked at the mortar around the stovepipe. He looked at the shelf construction, the way the brackets were cut into the stone rather than attached to the surface. "Warm in here," he said. "The hill moderates it." He looked at her. "I've got a cabin. Sealed it myself." "I know. You're here." He thought about that for a moment and decided not to argue with it. He accepted the cup of weak broth she poured him and drank it, and then said the thing he had come to say. "Silas Fugate has been asking around about this hill, specifically the western face." He kept his voice low, not a whisper, the register of a man choosing his audience. "He went to Creech before the storm, asked about property lines. Unclaimed land." Ezra Caudle's name came up. Pearl set her own cup down on the table. Next to the tin cup, she had not moved since she arrived, the one with the residue of someone else's coffee. "When did he ask Creech?" 2 days before the storm. She had left Silas's farm the morning the storm began. Silas had gone to Creech 2 days before that. He had known the storm was coming. He had known the timing. He had moved her out on the morning the roads would become impassable. There was a man at Silas's house the night before the storm, she said. A man in a good coat. Odell looked at her steadily. Lawyer, maybe, from the county seat. He was in our grain shed at 4 in the morning. Odell was quiet for a moment, looking for something, looking at something. On the second shelf from the bottom. She paused. There's nothing on that shelf now except grain sacks. But the dust was cleared the way you clear it when you're reading something that's laid flat. Odell put his cup down. A document, papers of some kind. Or a map, Pearl said. They sat with that for a moment. From the other side of the room came the sounds of 9 people managing proximity. Low conversation, the shift of bodies. Zeb Combs waking and asking for water, in the voice of a child, surprised to be warm. He timed it, Odell said finally. Not a question. He moved me out on the morning the road would close, before anyone could intervene, even if they'd wanted to. She looked at him. He's not coming out in this storm. He's waiting for it to end. Odell said, then so are we. The storm did not end. It thickened on the 3rd day, a second system moving in from the northwest over the diminishing, first piling new snow on drifts that had already exceeded anything the valley had seen in 15 years. The outer door became difficult to open from the inside, the drift against it now chest high, and Pearl and Odell together had to push it clear each morning. Reverend Elias Holbrook arrived on the 5th day. He was 60 and broad through the shoulders with a white beard. He kept short and eyes that had spent a long time watching people from the front of a room. He came down the steps and stood at the bottom and looked at what was now 11 people in the underground space and said nothing for a full minute. Processing. This is remarkable, he said then. Who built it? A man named Ezra Caudle, Pearl said. He died 7 years ago. Holbrook moved through the room, slowly examining the shelves, the stovework, the ceiling construction. He touched the mortar verge at a joint and nodded slightly, the involuntary nod of someone confirming a quality they suspected. He picked up the journal from where Pearl had left it on the rear shelf and opened the cover and read the first page and put it back with what looked like respect. Then he turned to Pearl with the particular quality of attention that comes from a man accustomed to holding a room. Someone needs to be accountable for this, he said, not unkindly, not as a challenge, as a statement of what he considered obvious. For how supplies are allocated, for decisions about who comes in and who doesn't. There are more people coming. There will be more difficult decisions. I've been making those decisions, Pearl said. You've been doing well, Holbrook said, and he meant it, which made what came next harder to deflect. But this situation has grown beyond what one person should manage alone, particularly a young person without standing in this community. He looked around the room. I think a small group of us people the Valley knows and trusts should take shared responsibility for how this place is run. The room was listening, all of it. Even Zeb Combs, sitting up on the bunk with a blanket across his shoulders, was watching. Pearl understood what was happening, not malice. Holbrook was not Silas. He genuinely believed what he was saying, which made him considerably more dangerous to argue with than someone who knew they were wrong. He had the credibility of decades in the logic of community and the reasonable-sounding words shared, and he was using all of it to reach for the thing she was currently holding. She said, Reverend Holbrook, do you know why the stovepipe doesn't ice at the joint where it passes through the ceiling? He blinked. I don't see what that has to do with. Do you know how long the grain in the back alcove stays viable and what the conditions are that shorten it? She did not wait. Do you know which jars to open first and which to leave sealed? Do you know what the ventilation pattern is in this room when the outer door is closed and we have a full fire and 12 people breathing? She looked at him steadily. Because I know all of those things, and I've been learning more every day. If there is someone here who knows them better than I do, I would like to meet that person right now. The room was very quiet. Holbrook looked at her for a long time. He was not a foolish man. He could read what the room was telling him, the weight of attention from 11 people who had been warm and fed for 5 days under the management of this girl in the patch coat. That is not the only consideration, he said, but the edge was gone from it. No, Pearl agreed, but it's the first one. He sat down. He did not concede. Men like Holbrook do not concede in public. But he sat down, and that was enough for now. That night, Pearl woke to the low murmur of voices from the far corner. She lay still and kept her breathing even, and listened. Two voices, Minerva Tackett and Holbrook, speaking in the register of a conversation that is trying not to be overheard. She could not make out most of it. The words were obscured by the breathing of 10 sleeping people and the low sound of the stove settling. But she heard her uncle's name, Silas, and then a sentence later, a phrase she caught clearly: "If we help him, he said he would." She did not move. She kept her breathing slow and even. And she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about a lawyer in a good coat examining shelves in a grain shed at 4 in the morning. She thought about 12 pages cut cleanly from a journal. She thought about timed departures and closed roads, and the words already said no written in a margin by someone who had said no, and then 7 years later had been found a half-mile from his shelter with nothing in his hands. She waited until the voices stopped and the room settled back into the sounds of sleep. Then she got up quietly and went to the rear shelf and found the journal and took it to the stove and opened it to the section before the missing pages. She was not reading for what was there. She was reading for the shape of what was missing. The pattern emerged over 2 careful hours. Caudle mentioned a man from the valley below twice in the surviving entries, both times without a name. The first mentioned 4 years before his death, asked about purchasing the land. Refused him. Then a gap in the record that corresponded to the missing pages. Then the entry that resumed after the cut section in slightly different handwriting, as if time had passed and the rhythm of writing had changed. And there near the bottom of that resuming page, the note in the margin that was not Caudle's hand. Already said no. Price. Not already said no to the purchase. Already said no to a price, a specific price. Someone had come back with a number, and Caudle had said no to that number, and the exchange had been significant enough that someone had written those words as a reminder or a record. And the pages that contained the full account of those negotiations had been removed. Recently, by someone who needed to ensure that account did not exist in any readable form. Pearl turned to the very back of the journal. She had read to the end before, but not examined the blank pages. Now she held the last blank page close to the stove and tilted it against the light. Impressions. The ghost of writing from a page that had been laid over this one while being written on. She could not read it directly, but she could read it as shape the downstroke of particular letters, the loop of a number. What she could make out in pieces and inference looked like it might be a record of a transaction. Numbers. A name or names. And at the bottom where a signature might go, the kind of mark that is made when both parties press a pen to paper. She closed the journal and held it in her hands in the dark and thought about what she did not yet have. She did not have the missing pages. She did not have a name attached to the man who had come to negotiate. She did not have proof of anything that would satisfy someone like Creech, who operated in the world of documents and procedures and would require more than impressions and inference. But she had the hinge. She understood the shape of it now. Silas wanted this land. He had wanted it for years. He had approached Caudle, been refused, returned with money, been refused again. He had spent years waiting and watching. When Caudle died or disappeared and the land passed into legal ambiguity, Silas had started the formal process of claiming it. 3 years of that process, Odell had told her. 3 years of paperwork moving slowly through county offices. And then 2 days before a storm that would close every road in the valley, he had moved his niece out of his house at the age of 17 in December with 12 miles to walk and no destination and no money, because his niece had grown up on the property adjacent to this hill, had walked these hills since she was 11, and might know things that would complicate his claim. He had not expected her to find the hill in the storm. He had expected her to disappear in it. Zeb Combs found the box on the 7th morning. He found it because he was 9 years old and had been confined to an underground room for a week and had explored every inch of the space that adults used, and so had begun exploring the spaces adults didn't. The gap behind the rearmost shelf, the low passage that led to the tool alcove, the space beneath the sleeping bunk, which was lower to the ground than standard construction, because Caudle had built for insulation rather than comfort. He came out from under the bunk with the box held in both hands in the particular expression of a child who knows he has found something significant. The box was small, plain wood with a latch but no padlock. Zeb set it on the bunk and looked at Pearl. On the lid, cut into the wood with a knife in the careful, deliberate strokes of someone who was making sure it would last, were the words, "For the one who stays." Pearl looked at the latch. It was a simple, hinged iron piece, the kind that can be lifted without a key. She lifted it. The lid opened. Inside were two items: a folded document sealed with wax, the seal showing a notary's mark, and a small iron key, the kind used not for doors, but for lockboxes or deed chests, with a simple bow and a single ward tooth. She unfolded the document carefully, working at the wax, without breaking the seal, entirely opening it enough to see the heading. It was a deed. Ezra Caudle's name appeared in the first line. The property description matched, she was certain of it, without having legal language to compare it to the hill, the western face, the specific boundary markers that Caudle had recorded in his journal entries. And at the bottom, a notary seal, dated 1879, legally witnessed, a valid title. But the deed was not what made Pearl sit down on the edge of the bunk and stare at the opposite wall for a long moment. It was the second page folded behind the deed. A single sheet in Caudle's handwriting, witnessed and dated 4 years before his death, which was either remarkable foresight or the work of a man who understood that his position was becoming dangerous. It was a simple document. It said that in the event of his death or incapacitation, the land and all property on it passed to whoever found and maintained this shelter in a time of need, provided the use served the community rather than private gain. No name. He had not known a name to write. He had known a type of person, and he had written the conditions, and he had put the document in a box and labeled the box for the one who stays. And he had put a key inside that did not match any lock she could find in the room. And then he had left one day to get supplies and had not come back. She was still holding the deed when the outer door opened and the cold came down the steps ahead of Silas Fugate. He came alone, but he had not come alone. Deputy Pershing Creech stood 2 steps behind him on the stairs, filling the passage with his large frame, and behind Creech, the rectangle of pale winter sky showed where the door stood open above. Silas stepped into the room. He looked at 11 people looking back at him. He looked at the shelves and the stove and the organized space. His face did not show surprise. He had known this was here. He had always known this was here. His eyes found Pearl. "You don't have any right to be here," he said. He said it evenly, not loudly, the way a man says something he is prepared to say. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper and held it out. Not to Pearl, to the room, to everyone. "I filed a claim with the county on this land. There's no valid deed on record. The owner died intestate, and I am the closest documented claimant by property adjacency." He let the paper open part way. "Anyone occupying this structure is doing so on my property." Pearl looked at Creech on the stairs. He was looking at the room. At Zeb Combs sitting up on the bunk. At Melinda Combs standing with her hand on her son's shoulder. At 11 people who had spent a week underground because the surface world had failed them. Creech was remembering a girl on a winter road. She could see it in his face, or she told herself she could, which might be the same thing. Silas was still looking at Pearl, and then he said quietly enough that only she could hear it clearly, "I figured the storm would settle things." She held up the deed. She held up both pages. Silas went very still. Creech from the stairs said, "What is that?" "A deed," Pearl said, "and a will. Notarized, witnessed." She kept her eyes on Silas. "He knew you were coming. He prepared for it." The room had no sound in it except the stove and the breathing of 11 people and the wind pressing uselessly against the hillside above. Silas looked at the documents in her hands. The calculation in his face was visible and then was not visible as he put something over it. He looked at Creech. Creech was looking at the papers with the expression of a man who has just understood that his situation is considerably more complicated than he was told it would be. "Those need to be authenticated," Silas said. "Yes," Pearl said, "they do." Nobody moved. That was the thing Pearl would remember long after the documents had been filed and the storm had become a story people told at winter tables. Not the words she had said, not the deed in her hand or the will behind it, but the stillness of 11 people in an underground room, watching Silas Fugate understand that the ground beneath his plan had shifted. Creech came down the last 2 steps and held out his hand, not to Silas, to Pearl. She gave him the documents. He read slowly, the way a man reads when he is being careful not to miss anything. He turned the deed over and examined the notary seal on the back. He read the will twice, moving his lips slightly on the second pass. Silas stood 3 feet away and said nothing, which told Pearl more than anything Silas might have said. A man who believed he had legal standing would have spoken. A man who was recalculating did not. These need to go to the county recorder, Creech said finally. He refolded the documents along their original creases and held them out to Pearl. Not to Silas. Until they're authenticated and recorded, nobody has a legal claim on anything here. That includes you, he said to Silas, and it includes the girl. Silas's jaw moved. Pershing, you know what I've been working toward? I know what you told me you were working toward, Creech said. These say something different about the history of it. He looked at Silas with the steady look of a man who has just privately revised an opinion and is deciding how much of that revision to show. My advice is you go home and let the county process sort itself out. The road, Silas said. Passable enough. You came up here on it. Silas looked at Pearl one more time. She expected the calculation she had seen before the cold reckoning of a man deciding what move to make next. Instead, she saw something she had not expected and did not know what to do with. She saw a man looking at a 17-year-old girl who had survived what he had reasonably expected would kill her, and finding in that survival something that went beyond the legal question, something that required him to look at himself in a way he had arranged his life to avoid. He put his coat collar up and turned and went up the stairs. The outer door opened and closed. The cold that came down the steps in his wake dissipated into the warmth of the room within seconds. Creech stood at the bottom of the stairs with the documents held carefully in both hands, as if he had just been given something fragile. I'll take these to the county recorder myself, he said. First clear day. He looked at Pearl. It will take time, weeks maybe longer, but what's here is documented now. He started up the stairs and then stopped with his boot on the second step. Miss Fugate, he said without turning around. I should have stopped the truck. He set it into the wall. The admission was not dressed up or explained. He had done a thing, and he knew he had done it, and he was saying so in the plainest words available. Next time stop, Pearl said. He went up the stairs, and the door closed behind him, and the room breathed. Holbrook was the first to acknowledge what had changed. He came to Pearl the morning after Silas's visit and stood beside her while she worked through the inventory of the grain alcove, checking sacks for moisture damage. He did not preamble. The document is legitimate, he said. I've seen enough land deeds in my time to know a properly executed one. I know. Caudle was a careful man. He picked up one of the grain sacks and squeezed it gently, checking density. He planned for someone to find this. He planned for someone like you to find it. He set the sack back. I didn't make things easy for you this week. No, I believed what I was saying. I want you to understand that. I wasn't acting for Silas. I was acting on what I thought was right. Pearl finished the sack she was examining and moved to the next one. I know that too. Holbrook was quiet for a moment. What can I do to be useful? She handed him the inventory list she had been keeping on a scrap of paper. Check these numbers against the shelves and tell me if I've missed anything. He took the paper and went to work without another word. That was the end of it between them, not because nothing had happened, but because they were both people who moved forward rather than backward, and the shelter required forward. Minerva Tackett left on the second morning after Silas's visit, when the road down the valley had been broken enough by Creech's vehicle to be passable on foot. She supervised the packing of her household's belongings with the efficiency of a woman who had managed a large property for 20 years and knew exactly how to get out of somewhere she no longer needed to be in. At the door she stopped. She reached into her coat and produced a ring. Gold plain band, the kind worn by someone who valued durability over display. She held it out to Pearl. For legal cost, she said, whatever comes next with the county. Pearl looked at the ring. It was worth more than she had ever held in her hands. I don't need charity, she said. It's not charity, Minerva said. It's an investment. This place is going to matter to this valley, and I'd rather be on the right side of what it becomes. She paused. Also, I behaved badly when I arrived. I know I did. I'm not going to perform contrition about it because that's not how I'm built, but I understand the ledger and I'm making a payment. Pearl took the ring. Minerva Tackett went up the stairs and did not look back, which was entirely consistent with everything Pearl had observed about her. The cook followed. Carl followed. The room was 3 people smaller and a measurable amount quieter. Odell watched this from across the room. When the door closed, he looked at Pearl with an expression that was almost amused. She's not wrong about the investment, he said. No, Pearl agreed. She's not. Araminta Sizemore came on the 4th day after the storm broke. She was 70 and moved like someone who had been 70 for a long time and had made an arrangement with the fact of it. She came down the steps without help, but slowly, one hand on the stone wall, and she stood at the bottom and looked at the room with the eyes of someone who had been expecting to see it for years. He talked about this place for a long time, she said. She did not need to say who. After his family died, building this was how he got through the first winter. And the second, every winter he added something. He said the work of it was the point, not just the having of it. Pearl showed her the boss, showed her the deed and the will. Araminta Sizemore examined them and nodded the way a person nods when they are confirming what they already knew. He brought me the key the last time he came to town, she said. Said if a girl ever came asking about the small key, I should give it to her. She looked at Pearl. I didn't know what girl. I didn't know when, but I knew it would be winter. He put the will in the box with the deed, Pearl said. Why did he need a separate key if the box wasn't padlocked? Araminta Sizemore smiled, which rearranged her face into something younger. Because the box wasn't the thing to be unlocked. She crossed the room and went to the rear wall and stood looking at the shelving. Then she said, he brought me here once, 2 winters before his leg gave out. Walked me through the whole room. Said the important things are in the stone, not the wood. If I ever came back without him, I'd know where to look. She reached behind the lowest shelf and felt along the stone, and after a moment her hand found something, and there was a sound, a quiet sound of a catch releasing. A section of the rear wall, perhaps 2 feet wide, swung inward. Not far, 6 inches. Enough to reveal that behind the shelf there was not solid earth, but another space, and in that space, folded in oilcloth and tied with wire, a package the size of a large book. He didn't trust wood for the important things, Araminta said. Said paper needed stone. Pearl reached in and took the package. She unwrapped it at the table with Odell and Holbrook and Araminta standing around her, the 4 of them close together in the lantern light. Inside were 3 items, the missing pages from the journal, 12 of them intact and in sequence, a letter addressed to whoever finds the deed in the will, and a second document that took Pearl a moment to identify and then a longer moment to understand fully. It was a record of a meeting, dated 3 years before Caudle's death. 2 men present, Ezra Caudle and 1 Silas Emmett Fugate. The subject of the meeting was the purchase of the Hillside property. The record showed Caudle's refusal of 2 separate offers, the second offer considerable, the amount recorded in Caudle's precise handwriting with no apparent exaggeration. At the bottom, Caudle had written, made clear that neither price nor circumstance would change my answer. SEF did not respond well to the final refusal. I am recording this meeting in full and placing it with the deed because I believe the record may be needed after I am gone. He had known. He had seen it clearly enough to prepare a legal record of it. Holbrook read the document over Pearl's shoulder. He was quiet for a long time. This is the authentication, he said finally. This is what makes the deed and the will impossible to successfully challenge. He straightened up. With this and Araminta as a living witness to the will's execution, Silas has nothing. Pearl folded the pages back into the oilcloth. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to feel something like triumph and instead felt something quieter and harder to name. Caudle had laid all of this out with the patience of a man who could not know when it would be used or by whom, only that it would be needed. He had spent years preparing for a future he would not see. She was standing in that future now. She looked at Araminta Sizemore. Did he know at the end, she asked, that Silas was the danger? Araminta's expression said everything before her words did. He knew he'd refused Silas twice, and Silas was not a man who accepted refusal without response. He knew the legal process Silas had started. He knew the leg injury was bad, and he knew he had to get to town before the snow. She paused. He went in daylight on the road. He wasn't hiding. Maybe he thought that mattered, that being in plain sight on the road mattered. Pearl thought about Caudle on that road, a man in his 60s with a bad leg and a long walk, carrying nothing, having left everything locked and hidden in the earth behind him. Walking toward town, getting partway there. She thought about what Odell had told her about Caudle found without anything in his hands. She did not say what she was thinking out loud. Some things, once said, take a shape that cannot be unsaid. Some things are better held as private knowledge that guides future action rather than public accusation that requires proof she did not have. Silas Fugate was a man who had done what convenient men do. The ground had answered him in its own and the answer was standing in this room holding the documents he had needed to not exist. That was enough. Creech came back on the 6th day after the storm with a receipt from the county recorder's office. He handed it to Pearl without ceremony. "Deed is on record," he said. "Will is in the probate queue. Recorder says given the age of the documents and the witness still being alive, it's straightforward." He looked around the shelter, which now held only Pearl, Odell, Melinda Combs, and Zeb, the others having returned to their homes as the roads cleared. Silas filed a formal objection. "I expected that," Pearl said. "Recorder expects it to fail, so does the county attorney who I spoke with this morning on your behalf." He paused. "You'll need representation eventually, someone to speak for you in the process." "I'm aware." He reached into his coat and took out a card, a lawyer's name, county seat, address. "He does this kind of work. He owes me a favor." He set the card on the table next to the tin cup that Pearl had still not moved. "Use the favor." Pearl picked up the card. She looked at Creech, who was looking at the tin cup with the slightly puzzled expression of a man who has just noticed something that has been in plain sight. "That cup," he said. "Someone was here before me," she said. "I don't know who. I don't know if it matters now." Creech picked up, Covett looked at it, set it back down. His expression moved through something and came out the other side without showing what it had been. He went up the stairs without further comment, which Pearl had come to understand was his particular way of closing a conversation that had reached its useful end. Silas came for the last time in late January, not on a day with intention behind it, not with a lawyer or a deputy or documents. He came on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was clear and the snow had compacted to a hard crust that held weight if you walked carefully, and Pearl was outside the shelter, splitting wood she had hauled up from the fallen timber on the north face of the hill. She heard him before she saw him, the crunch of crust under boots, and she looked up to see him standing at the base of the slope looking up at her. He had walked up from the valley. His breath showed in the cold air. He was not wearing his good coat. He was wearing the working coat he had worn every winter for as long as she could remember, the one with the frayed left pocket and the button that had been replaced in a slightly different color. He stood there. He did not come up the slope. He did not call out. He looked at her and at the shelter entrance behind her and at the path that led to it, a real path now worn by the boots of 40 or 50 people over the course of the winter. He looked at the slope of the hill above the entrance, where the snow lay smooth and unbothered over the earth that held the structure beneath it. Pearl set the axe against the splitting stump. For a moment, she considered going down to him. The slope was not long, 20 steps, and she could be standing in front of him, and they could have whatever conversation was available to people who had done what they had done to each other. She thought about what that conversation would look like, and what it would accomplish, and what it would cost her, and what it would cost him. She stayed where she was. After a time, Silas turned and began walking back down toward the valley. He walked the way he always walked, with his shoulders square and his pace steady, and she watched him until the slope of the land dropped him below her sight line, and the only evidence of his passage was the line of boot prints in the crusted snow. She did not feel relief. She did not feel victory. She felt the specific quality of an ending that has not resolved into anything clean, but has resolved nonetheless the way a long illness ends, not with recovery, but with the body simply deciding to continue. She picked up the axe and went back to work. Zeb Combs found her up there 2 hours later. He had taken to climbing the hill in the afternoons when his mother allowed it, partly from the habit of a child who had spent a transformative week underground and wanted proximity to the thing that had transformed him, and partly because he was 9 years old. And the shelter entrance with its hidden door in the hillside was the most interesting thing within walking distance. He sat on a stone and watched her split wood for a while without speaking, which Pearl had come to appreciate about him. He had learned during his week in the shelter that silence in the presence of another person was not the same as loneliness, and he had applied that lesson in a way that made him easier to be around than most adults she knew. "My mother says you can stay with us," he said eventually. "If you want. There's a room off the kitchen." "I know." She didn't say it as charity. She said it because you know things she doesn't, and she wants to learn them. Pearl set a split piece on the pile. "What do you want?" Zeb thought about it with the seriousness of a child who understands when he has been asked a real question. "I want you to stay on the hill," he said, "but I know you can't stay in the shelter all the time because of how supplies work and also because you'd go crazy." He considered further. "My mother's room is on the second floor, and you can see this hill from the window." Pearl looked at him. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. Since the fifth day, he said, I had a lot of time underground. She laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly real and unguarded, the laugh of someone who had not laughed in long enough that the muscles for it had gotten rusty. Zeb grinned at the success of it with the satisfaction of a child who has accomplished something he set out to accomplish. Tell your mother I'll come down for supper, Pearl said. We can talk about the room. She stayed on the hill until the light went entirely, finishing the wood split and stacking it under the oilcloth and doing the end-of-day check of the shelter that had become as automatic as breathing. Fire banked correctly. Vent cracked the right amount. Food inventory updated in her notebook, which was not Caudle's notebook, but her own, begun on the second week of January in the same spare practical style he had used. Temperatures, consumption rates, notes on what worked. On the back inside cover of the notebook, she had copied the words she found carved into the rear wall, the inscription she had discovered after the last of the winter guests had gone home, and she had been alone in the shelter for the first time since Melinda Combs arrived. Someone before Caudle, the chisel marks older than his construction, older than his mortar and his timber beams, had cut 7 words into the stone of the hillside. The ground remembers what the sky forgets. She did not know who had put those words there or when or in what circumstance. She knew only that they had been cut by someone who had also found this hill, also understood something about what the earth held versus what the air gave and took away, and had wanted to leave a record that would outlast them. As Caudle had wanted to leave a record, as Pearl was now in her own way leaving a record in the careful columns of her notebook. She closed the shelter door and latched it and stood on the hillside in the last gray light. Below her, the valley was beginning to show lights and windows, the small yellow warmth of households that had come through the worst winter in a decade with their losses and their lessons, and their altered understanding of what a hard season required. She could see the Combs house from here, the second-floor window that Zeb had described, a warm square in the early dark. She thought about Caudle walking down this hill for the last time, prepared for a future he would not see, carrying nothing. She thought about the man who had come before Caudle, chisel in hand, cutting words into the hillside for no one in particular, and everyone eventually. She thought about a summer that would come, and the work of restocking the shelter before autumn, and the specific knowledge she had accumulated over a winter that had tried to kill her and had instead taught her the way winters teach the people who survive them. Not gently, not with explanations, but thoroughly. She went down the hill. The path was clear and well-worn underfoot, packed firm by the boots of everyone who had climbed it during the storm and everyone who had climbed it since. By spring, it would need to be properly maintained, graded, and graveled at the steeper sections. By summer, there would likely be people wanting to build their own versions of Caudle's shelter hillside cellars dug into the earth above the frost line, stocked and sealed before the leaves turned. She had already started drawing the designs, not from any formal knowledge of construction, but from 6 years of patching fences and shoring foundations and watching what held and what failed, combined with the detailed engineering of one dead man's journal and the 7 words in stone that were older than any of it. At the bottom of the hill, she stopped and looked back up. The shelter entrance was invisible from here, as it was meant to be, as Caudle had built it to be. The hillside was just a hillside, snow-covered and unremarkable, giving nothing away to a person who did not know where to look. She knew where to look. She turned toward the Combs house and its lit window and began walking down the valley road, and the packed snow held her weight without breaking, and the cold was the honest cold of a clear January evening, rather than the killing cold of the storm, and the lights below her grew slowly closer, and behind her the hills stood in the dark, holding everything it had always held, patient and full, and waiting for whoever came next.